It took me 32 years to understand that the rule I broke wasn't really a rule at all. It was a test. And the silence that followed my disobedience wasn't punishment. It was confirmation. I used to think I was broken, that something in me was wired wrong, that everyone else had received an instruction manual for being part of this family, and somehow mine had pages missing. But here's what I've learned. The manual wasn't missing. I had simply read it too carefully. The problem was never that I disobeyed. The problem was that I noticed there was something to disobey in the first place. They called me difficult. But difficult is just their word for someone who wouldn't participate in the collective delusion. They said I was always causing problems. What they meant was I made the problems visible. When you're the black sheep, people assume you're the one who needs fixing, that you're angry or rebellious or hungry for attention. None of that was true. I wasn't difficult. I was just the only one who refused to pretend the emperor was wearing clothes. The rule they gave me was simple. Don't question. Don't point out inconsistencies. Don't make anyone uncomfortable by being honest. Just play your part. Just smile. Just agree. Just disappear into whatever role makes everyone else feel better about themselves. I tried. God knows I tried. But pretending has a price. And I reached a point where I simply couldn't afford it anymore. It started with small things. Things so small that when I tried to explain them to anyone outside the family, they'd look at me like I was being dramatic. Maybe I was. Or maybe I had just learned to measure pain in increments so tiny they couldn't be seen with the naked eye. Like the way my mother would tell a story at dinner. She'd recount something that happened during the day, and my siblings would nod along, laugh at the right moments, add their own observations. But if I contributed anything, she'd pause. Not long. Just a beat. A fraction of a second where her face would go blank, like I'd interrupted a song she was enjoying. Then she'd continue, as if I hadn't spoken at all. I tested this once, deliberately. I shared something mundane about my day, just to see what would happen. The pause came right on cue. Then my mother turned to my sister and asked about her new apartment, as if the last 30 seconds had simply been deleted from reality, or the way my father would ask everyone about their day. He'd sit at the head of the table and go around clockwise. My older brother would share something about work, and my father would lean forward, ask follow-up questions, offer advice. My younger sister would talk about her classes, and he'd nod thoughtfully, make encouraging comments. When it got to me, he'd suddenly remember he needed to refill his water glass. By the time he came back, we'd moved on to dessert. The first few times, I thought it was coincidence, but it happened over and over, always at the exact moment when attention would naturally turn to me. It was so consistent, it became a dark joke I'd tell myself. And now, Dad's water glass moment. These weren't dramatic moments, they were glances, silences, small edits in the family story where I was systematically removed from the narrative. My mother had a particular way of introducing us to people. This is my son, David. He's in finance. Making partner next year, probably. This is my daughter, Anna. She's studying medicine at Johns Hopkins, going to be a surgeon. Then she'd get to me, and her voice would change. Slightly, almost imperceptibly. And this is... Then she'd trail off, smile, and pivot to something else. Anyway, we're so glad you could join us. I remember standing there once, at a neighbor's party, watching this exact sequence play out. David in finance. Anna, the future surgeon. Me, the ellipsis. Later, driving home, I asked her about it. About what? She said. The way you introduce us. I introduce you all the same way. And maybe she believed that. Maybe in her mind she did. But I'd been watching. I'd been counting. and the pattern was unmistakable. As if I was a footnote, she couldn't quite remember how to cite. A character in the family story whose name she kept forgetting. Holidays were worse. Everyone would gather at my parents' house, and there was this choreographed quality to it all. My brother would arrive with expensive wine that he'd researched specifically to pair with whatever my mother was cooking. My father would examine the bottle, compliment his taste, talk about the vineyard. My sister would bring flowers, always the exact kind my mother loved, arranged perfectly. They'd gush over them together. I'd bring things too. Good things, thoughtful things. Once I brought a book I knew my mother had wanted, something she'd mentioned months earlier in passing. I'd remembered. I'd ordered it. I'd wrapped it carefully. She opened it, said, "Oh, that's nice," and set it aside. 2 weeks later, I saw it at a charity donation box in their garage, still in its wrapper. My sister would help my mother in the kitchen, and they'd laugh about some inside joke, their hands moving in synchronized motions as they chopped and stirred. I'd offer to help, and my mother would say, No, you just relax." But it wasn't an invitation to rest. It was a removal from participation. Once, I insisted, "Please, let me do something." "You can set the table," she said, with this tone that made it clear I was being difficult. I set the table. When I was done, she came out to check, and quietly, without comment, rearranged everything I'd done. The forks were in the wrong position. The napkins were folded incorrectly. The glasses were on the wrong side. I'd been setting tables my entire life. I knew how to do it. But apparently not well enough. I'd sit in the living room, watching my family move around each other like a well-rehearsed dance, and I was the only one who didn't know the steps. Except that's not quite right. I knew the steps. I'd learned them same as everyone else. I just wasn't invited to perform them. Or worse, when I tried to perform them, I was doing it wrong. Always wrong. The timing was off. The execution was flawed. The effort itself was somehow incorrect. There were jokes, too, always disguised as affection. "Oh, you know how he is," my mother would say, laughing, when I'd miss a family function because of work. Except my brother missed them too, and she'd call that dedication to his career. When I'd share an opinion about politics or current events, my father would smile indulgently and say, "Always the philosopher," in a tone that made it clear philosophy was a polite word for impractical. My brother would share the exact same opinion, using different words, and my father would nod seriously and say, "That's a smart analysis." I started testing this too. Started paying attention to how the same sentence would land differently depending on who said it. My sister would suggest a restaurant, and everyone would enthusiastically agree it was a great idea. I'd suggest the same restaurant, and someone would mention how expensive it was, how far away, how maybe we should try somewhere else. The comparisons were constant and surgical, never obvious enough to call out, always sharp enough to draw blood. "Your brother just got promoted again. He's so driven." Translation, "Why aren't you more like him?" "Your sister volunteers at the hospital on weekends. She has such a big heart." Translation, "You're selfish by comparison." "Your cousin Michael just bought a house. His parents must be so proud." Translation, "We're not proud of you." And me? I was the unfinished sentence. The story that didn't quite fit the family album. The accomplishment that was never quite impressive enough. The effort that was never quite sufficient. The presence that was never quite valued. I had accomplishments too. A good job, a nice apartment, friends, hobbies, a life I'd built myself. But none of it seemed to matter when measured against their standards. Or rather, against the standards they applied to me. which were somehow different from the standards they applied to everyone else. My brother got promoted? Incredible. We need to celebrate. I got promoted? Oh, that's nice. Is there room to move up from there? My sister bought new furniture. It's beautiful. Such good taste. I bought new furniture. That must have been expensive. Are you sure that was wise? I started noticing patterns. At family gatherings, they'd take photos. Lots of photos. But I was always somehow out of frame. Or they'd take the photo just as I looked away. At first, I thought I was just unlucky. But then I started paying attention. Okay, everyone get together. Someone would arrange people. David, you stand there. Anna, next to Mom. Perfect. Everyone smile. And where was I? Behind someone, or to the side, or somehow not in the frame when the camera clicked. Oops, let's take another one. Click. One more, just to be sure. Click. Later, checking social media, I'd see the chosen photos. The ones where I wasn't visible, or I was blurred, or I was half out of frame. Those were the ones they posted. The ones where I was clearly visible, centered, present. Those were never selected. When I'd check social media later, there would be albums from holidays, birthdays, celebrations. Albums with hundreds of photos. I appeared in maybe 1 out of every 15. And in those rare appearances, I was always on the edge, partially cut off, slightly blurred, or making a weird face, or looking away. Meanwhile, my siblings appeared in every photo, perfectly framed, perfectly lit, perfectly present. I thought about saying something. Hey, I noticed I'm not in many of the family photos. But I could already hear the response. What? That's not true. You're in plenty of photos. You're being too sensitive. And maybe I was. Maybe I was counting things that didn't need to be counted. Maybe I was finding patterns that didn't exist. Except the patterns kept appearing. Over and over, year after year. In ways too consistent to be accidental. It was like being erased in real time. Not dramatically, not all at once. Just slowly, consistently, methodically. Until I started to wonder if I was actually there at all. I'd be at a family dinner, sitting at the table, speaking, eating, existing. But I'd have this strange dissociative feeling, like I was watching myself from a distance. This ghost person who everyone could see through. I'd make a comment and watch it land in the silence and disappear. I'd tell a story and watch eyes glaze over, attention drift away, the conversation move on as if I'd never spoken. And the worst part? They'd insist it wasn't happening. You're part of this family. We love you. Why are you being so distant? As if distance was something I'd chosen rather than something I'd been systematically pushed into. As if I was the one creating the space, rather than the one trying desperately to close it. But the space kept growing. With every overlooked comment, every rearranged table setting, every photo I wasn't quite in, every story that continued as if I hadn't spoken, every introduction that trailed off into ellipsis. The space grew until it became a chasm. And I was on one side, and they were on the other, and everyone pretended it didn't exist. It wasn't until I was in my late 20s that I learned there was a term for what I was. A role I'd been playing without ever auditioning for it. Scapegoat. Every family needs someone to carry what no one wants to admit. Someone to absorb the unspoken shame, the unacknowledged dysfunction, the collective anxiety that bubbles beneath the surface of every perfect family portrait. That was me. I was the one they could point to when things went wrong. The one whose absence from family events could be blamed for the tension. The one whose differences could be discussed in concerned whispers, as if my existence was a problem they were all working together to solve. But here's the thing about being a scapegoat. The role only works if you accept it. If you internalize the story they're telling about you. If you believe that you're the source of the discomfort, rather than just the person willing to name it. For years, I did accept it. I thought there was something fundamentally wrong with me. That I was too sensitive, too analytical, too much of everything they didn't want me to be, and not enough of what they did. I went to therapy. I read books about communication. I tried to be better, softer, easier. I thought if I could just figure out the right way to exist, they'd finally see me, finally accept me, finally let me in. But that's not how it works. Because the problem was never me. The problem was that they needed me to be the problem. My family had built an entire identity around being functional, successful, put together. And maintaining that identity required someone to carry all the parts that didn't fit that story. I was carrying their shame, their disappointment, their fear of being seen as anything less than perfect. And the moment I understood that, everything changed. The rule I broke wasn't dramatic. I didn't yell. I didn't storm out. I didn't make a scene. I just stopped pretending. It was Thanksgiving. We were all gathered around the table, and my mother was telling a story about a family vacation from when we were kids. But the story she was telling wasn't true. Not entirely. She'd edited out entire sections, rearranged events, smoothed over the rough parts until it sounded like a commercial for a happy family. I'd heard this story before. We all had. It was part of the family mythology, one of those stories that gets told and retold until it becomes more real than the actual memory. But this time, sitting there, watching everyone nod and smile and add their own embellishments to the fiction, something in me just stopped. "That's not how it happened," I said. Not loudly, not angrily, just calmly, factually. The table went quiet. My mother looked at me, her smile frozen in place. "What do you mean?" "That vacation," I said. "You're remembering it wrong. We didn't all have a great time. I got sick the second day and spent most of the trip in the hotel room. And you and Dad fought almost every night." You could hear the silence like a physical thing. It pressed against the walls, filled the spaces between us, made the air thick and hard to breathe. "I don't remember it that way," my mother said, her voice tight. "I do," I said. That was it. That was the unforgivable act. Not rage, not cruelty, just honesty. I'd refused to cooperate with the lie. I'd pointed out the gap between the story they wanted to tell and the truth of what actually happened. And in doing so, I'd threatened the entire structure they'd built. My father cleared his throat. "Let's not do this at dinner." But I wasn't doing anything. I was just existing, just being honest, just refusing to pretend that the version of reality they preferred was the only version that mattered. "I'm not trying to start anything," I said. "I'm just saying that's not how I remember it." "Well, maybe your memory is faulty," my sister said, her voice sharp. She always jumped to their defense. She had to. Her entire identity was built on being the good daughter. My questioning the narrative threatened her role as much as theirs. "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe we all remember it differently." That should have been the end of it. A minor disagreement, a difference of perspective. But in my family, that kind of honesty was treasonous. Because I hadn't just corrected a story. I'd broken the agreement. The unspoken contract that said, we all protect the image, we all maintain the fiction, we all play our parts. I'd stepped out of my role, and in doing so, I'd made everyone else's role visible too. The rest of dinner was cold, polite. Everyone spoke in careful, measured tones, like they were all walking on ice that might crack at any moment. I tried to lighten the mood. I asked my brother about his work. I complimented my sister's new apartment. I thanked my mother for the meal. But it was too late. The damage was done. I'd committed the cardinal sin. I'd told the truth. The silence didn't come all at once. It was gradual, surgical, precise in a way that made me question whether it was even happening. The first thing I noticed was the text messages. Before Thanksgiving, the family group chat was constant. Photos of my nephew's soccer game, updates about my grandmother's doctor appointments, questions about schedules for upcoming holidays, jokes, memes, random observations about the weather or traffic, or something someone saw on the news. It was alive, active, a digital space where we all existed together. After that dinner, the messages continued. But my replies went unanswered. Not ignored, exactly. Just not acknowledged. Someone would share a photo of my nephew. My siblings would react with hearts and comments. "He's getting so big. Look at that smile. Can't wait to see him this weekend." I'd add my own comment. "He looks great. Tell him I said hi." Nothing. The conversation would continue. More reactions, more comments. Plans would be made. Details would be shared. All happening around my message like water flowing around a stone. At first, I thought maybe they hadn't seen it. Maybe it got buried in the thread. So I'd try again. "What time is everyone meeting this weekend?" Silence. Then, later, I'd see messages about the gathering. "Thanks for hosting, Mom. Great to see everyone." Photos of them all together. An event I didn't know was happening, discussed in a group chat I was part of, as if I wasn't there at all. I started testing it. I'd send messages at different times, ask direct questions, react to photos. Nothing inflammatory, nothing accusatory, just normal family chat participation. My messages existed in this strange limbo. Visible, but not seen. Present, but not acknowledged. Like I was speaking into a void that looked like a conversation. The worst part was the timestamps. I could see when people were active, see when they read messages, see when they were responding to each other, and see when they were carefully, deliberately not responding to me. It was so obviously intentional that it stopped feeling like exclusion and started feeling like coordination, like they'd all agreed, without ever explicitly discussing it, that I no longer existed in the family ecosystem. Then the invitations started to thin. There was a birthday party for my nephew in March. I found out about it 3 days after it happened. I checked the group chat, nothing. I checked my email, nothing. I'd had no calls, no texts, no smoke signals. I called my brother. "Hey, I saw photos from Jake's birthday. Looked fun." "Oh yeah," he said. His voice was casual, but there was something underneath it. Something careful. It was pretty low-key. I didn't know about it. "Really? I thought Mom sent you the info." She hadn't. I knew she hadn't. He knew she hadn't. But this was the game now. Pretend the exclusion was an accident, an oversight, a simple miscommunication that had nothing to do with that Thanksgiving dinner months ago. "Must have gotten lost," I said. "Yeah, that happens. Next time." There wouldn't be a next time. We both knew it. My sister got engaged in April. I learned about it from Facebook. She'd posted photos of the proposal, the ring, her beaming face next to her fiancé. Hundreds of comments, congratulations flooding in. I wasn't in any of the photos taken after the proposal. The ones with family. Mom crying happy tears, Dad shaking the future son-in-law's hand, my brother giving his serious older brother speech. All captured, all posted, all celebrated. Without me. I called her the next day. "Congratulations! I saw the photos. The ring is beautiful." "Thanks." Her voice was pleasant but distant, like she was talking to an acquaintance instead of her brother. I would have loved to be there. "Yeah, well, it was kind of spontaneous, just immediate family." I was immediate family, but apparently I'd been reclassified, moved from inner circle to outer orbit, from family to family adjacent, from included to optional. "When are you thinking for the wedding?" I asked. "We're keeping it small, just a simple thing." In the months that followed, I watched the wedding planning happen on social media. Not small, not simple. A full event with a venue, a caterer, a photographer, bridesmaids, groomsmen, the works. I was never asked to be part of it. Never consulted on dates. Never sent the invitation that everyone else received months in advance. When I finally brought it up, carefully, diplomatically, my sister sighed like I was being difficult. "Look, we're trying to keep costs down. We can't invite everyone." Everyone else was invited. Cousins I barely knew, family friends I'd met maybe twice, people from her yoga class, but not me. Because keeping costs down apparently meant cutting the brother while inviting near strangers. Christmas planning happened without me. They'd always done a big celebration at my parents' house, multiple days, elaborate meals, gift exchanges, games, traditions we'd built up over decades. I assumed I was invited. I was waiting for the details. When should I arrive? What should I bring? Were we doing the same gift exchange rules as last year? The details never came. Finally, December 23rd, I called my mother. "Hey, what time do you want me there on Christmas Eve?" There was a pause, a long one, the kind of pause that contains entire conversations. "Oh," she said. "Well, we're doing something different this year." "Different how?" "Just a quiet thing. Low-key. You don't have to feel obligated to come." The phrasing was masterful. I don't have to feel obligated. As if I was being released from a burden I'd never claimed to carry. As if my presence was a duty I was being graciously excused from. "I don't feel obligated," I said. "I want to be there. I'm family." "Of course you are." Her voice was warm now, reassuring. "We just thought, with how busy you've been, with how distant you've seemed lately, maybe you'd want some space." I hadn't been distant. They'd created the distance. But now, they were reframing it as my choice, my doing, my preference. "I haven't been distant," I said. "Well, that's how it feels from our end. How it feels from their end. As if feelings were facts. As if their perception of reality was the only one that mattered." I went anyway. Showed up on Christmas morning with gifts I'd spent weeks selecting. Thoughtful things. Things that showed I'd been paying attention to what people mentioned wanting throughout the year. The look on my mother's face when she opened the door wasn't surprise. It was disappointment. Irritation masked as surprise. Like I'd violated an unspoken agreement by showing up uninvited, even though I'd never been explicitly told not to come. "Oh, you came." As if my presence was as unexpected as a package from a stranger. Everyone was there. My brother with his wife and kids. My sister with her fiancé. My father's brother and his family. My mother's best friend. Even the neighbors from 2 houses down who'd always been like family. And me, the unexpected guest. The day was excruciating. Everyone was performing this elaborate theater of normalcy, and I was somehow both on stage and invisible. We sat in the living room opening gifts. The kids went first, tearing through wrapping paper, squealing with delight. Then, the adults. When they got to my gifts, there was this palpable awkwardness. My brother opened a book I knew he'd wanted about architecture. "Oh, that's great. Thanks." He set it aside quickly, as if holding it too long would burn his hands. My sister opened hers, a piece of jewelry I'd seen her eyeing months ago. "It's nice. A little extravagant, though." As if I'd done something wrong by getting her exactly what she wanted. Their gifts to me were clearly last-minute, gift cards with no personal message. Generic items that could have been for anyone. Things that screamed, "We forgot you were coming." The conversations flowed around me. They'd reference things that had happened at gatherings I hadn't been at. Inside jokes from dinners I wasn't invited to. Plans for future events I wouldn't be included in. "Remember when we went to that restaurant in October?" "Oh my God, yes! When Dad ordered that thing he couldn't pronounce." Laughter all around. They'd look at each other with these knowing glances. Shared memories I wasn't part of. A history I'd been systematically excluded from. At one point, my nephew asked me a question. "Uncle Jake, can you play Mario Kart with me?" Before I could answer, my brother intervened. "Actually, buddy, Grandma needs help in the kitchen. Maybe later." There was no later. I went to the kitchen to refill my coffee. When I came back, the conversation stopped. Not abruptly, just paused. They all looked at me with these pleasant, blank faces, placid smiles that didn't reach their eyes. Then my father said something about the weather, and everyone nodded enthusiastically, grateful for the neutral topic, for the safe territory, for the conversation that didn't require my exclusion to be visible. I was the conversation that stopped when I entered the room. Over the next few months, it continued, accelerated even. They'd schedule family dinners on dates I'd mentioned I was free. They'd plan gatherings on nights I'd explicitly said I had conflicts. When I'd suggest alternative dates, there would be vague excuses. "Oh, that doesn't work for David. Anna has a thing that night. Mom and Dad are busy then." But then I'd see photos from events on exactly those alternative dates I'd suggested. All of them there. All of them available, apparently. Just not available for me. The group chat became a chronicle of a family I was no longer part of. Photos from brunches I didn't know about. Updates from trips I wasn't invited on. Celebrations I only learned about after they'd happened. I stopped contributing to the chat entirely. Stopped reacting. Stopped commenting. For 2 months, I was completely silent in that digital space. No one noticed. No one reached out. No one asked if I was okay. The conversation continued without interruption. Hundreds of messages. Thousands of reactions. An active, vibrant family communication ecosystem that functioned perfectly well without my participation. I'd see photos online of them all together, always together. Dinners at restaurants I loved but was never invited to. Trips to places we'd always talked about going as a family. Beach weekends, holiday gatherings, birthday celebrations, and every single photo was tagged with some variation of family time, or blessed, or grateful for these people, or love my family. The message was clear. This is the family. These are the people. And you're not part of it anymore. But they never said it out loud. That would have been too honest, too direct, too real. Instead, they communicated through absence, through coldness, through the systematic removal of my presence from their lives while maintaining the fiction that nothing had changed. And the cruelest part? If I confronted them, they'd act confused, hurt even. "What are you talking about? You're always welcome." As if welcome was something you could declare without ever actually extending it. As if invitation was implied rather than offered. as if my presence was assumed even as it was systematically discouraged. They'd say I was being too sensitive, that I was imagining things, that I was the one creating distance. "We text you all the time." They didn't. "You're always invited to things." I wasn't. "You're the one who doesn't come around." I wasn't told where to come around to. The gaslighting was comprehensive, meticulous. Every exclusion was framed as my choice. Every cold shoulder was interpreted as my distance. Every silence was presented as my fault. I was invited to exist on the periphery, to show up when convenient, to play my role as the slightly estranged son who chose distance, who was busy, who was going through something, who would come back eventually, once he worked through whatever it was he was working through. But if I wanted actual connection, actual inclusion, actual belonging, that required agreeing to the terms, required returning to the role they'd assigned me, required pretending that Thanksgiving dinner had never happened, required accepting that their version of reality was the only version that existed, required apologizing for things I hadn't done, and accepting blame for dynamics I hadn't created, required silence about what I knew to be true, and I couldn't do it. I tried. I genuinely tried. But every time I thought about calling, about reaching out, about trying again, I'd remember the pattern, the systematic erasure, the careful coordination of my exclusion. And I'd realize they don't want me to come back. They want me to accept my exile. There's a difference. I kept trying. For months, I kept trying. I'd reach out, suggest coffee with my siblings, send gifts for birthdays, show up at the events I did manage to learn about. I'd be warm, friendly, interested. I'd ask questions about their lives and listen carefully to the answers. I'd try to find ways to connect, to bridge the gap that had formed. But nothing changed. Or rather, the only thing that changed was me. I started to see the pattern more clearly. I started to understand that no amount of effort on my part would shift the dynamic, because the dynamic wasn't about my behavior. It was about my function. They needed me to be distant so they could be close. They needed me to be wrong so they could be right. They needed me to be the problem so they could be the solution. And I was exhausted. That's when it happened. Not a dramatic realization, not a sudden epiphany, just a quiet, accumulating awareness that settled into my bones over time. I was at a work function, talking to a colleague about her family. She was describing her relationship with her mother, and she said something that stopped me cold. "She loves me, but she doesn't like me." I'd never heard it phrased that way before, but it named something I'd been feeling for years. My family loved me, or they told me they did. They'd say it at the end of phone calls, sign it on birthday cards, post it on social media. But they didn't like me. They didn't enjoy my company. They didn't seek out my presence. They didn't value my perspective. They didn't want to know me. They loved the idea of me, the version of me that existed in their minds, the son who was quiet, compliant, grateful, the one who smiled in photos and didn't ask difficult questions and made them look good by association. But the actual me, the person I was, they didn't want that. They never had. And I realized something else. Acceptance in this family had a price. It required betraying myself. It required agreeing to things I knew were false. It required allowing myself to be erased in small, constant ways. It required participating in a story that had no room for my truth. I thought about that Thanksgiving dinner, about the vacation story my mother had told, about how she'd remembered it as perfect, and I'd remembered it as painful. Both memories were real. Both existed simultaneously. But in my family, there was only room for one version of reality. theirs, and maintaining their version required my silence. That's when I understood. This wasn't about that one dinner. It wasn't about one story or one disagreement. It was about control, about who got to define reality, about whose truth mattered. And mine didn't. Mine never had. I sat in my apartment that night, thinking about all the times I'd apologized for things that weren't my fault, all the times I'd modified my behavior to make others comfortable, all the times I'd made myself smaller so they could feel bigger. And I thought, what if I stopped? Not in anger, not in revenge, just in clarity. What if I stopped trying to earn something that was never going to be freely given? What if I stopped participating in a relationship that required me to disappear? What if I just let go? The hardest part wasn't making the decision. It was living with what came after. I stopped reaching out. Not in some dramatic declaration of independence. I just stopped initiating. Stopped sending the texts that went unanswered. Stopped suggesting the meetings that never happened. Stopped showing up to events I was only half invited to. I thought maybe they'd notice. Maybe they'd reach out. Maybe the absence of my effort would create space for theirs. They didn't notice. Or if they did, they didn't care. My phone got quieter. The group chat continued, but my absence from it didn't create any ripples. Birthdays passed without calls. Holidays came and went without invitations. And slowly, over months, I realized I was grieving something I'd never actually had. I was grieving the family I'd wanted, the family I'd thought we could be if I just tried hard enough. The family I'd believed existed beneath the coldness and the silence and the systematic exclusion. But that family had never existed. It was a fantasy I'd been clinging to, a story I'd been telling myself to make the reality more bearable. The loneliness wasn't about being alone. I had friends, I had a life. I had people who actually wanted me around. The loneliness was about accepting that the people who were supposed to want me around didn't. The people who were supposed to see me couldn't. The people who were supposed to love me conditionally loved something that had never been me at all. There were nights when I'd scroll through social media and see photos of them together. Still gathering, still celebrating, still performing the role of happy family. Just without me. And I'd feel this strange mix of pain and relief. Pain, because the exclusion was now complete. Relief, because I was no longer pretending it wasn't happening. I stopped performing too. Stopped curating my life for their approval. Stopped making choices based on what they'd think. Stopped trying to be the version of myself that might finally be acceptable. And in that space, in that absence of performance, I started to find something I hadn't expected. Myself. Not the self they wanted. Not the self I thought I should be. Just me. The person I was when no one was watching. When no one was judging. When no one was comparing me to a standard I could never meet. I started writing. Something I'd always wanted to do but had never felt permission for. I started traveling. Taking trips to places I wanted to see, rather than places that would look good in photos. I started saying no to things that drained me, and yes to things that filled me up. I built a life that was mine. Fully, completely mine. But the loneliness was still there. Not constant, but present. A quiet ache that would surface at unexpected moments. At holidays, at milestones, at random Tuesday afternoons when I'd remember some small moment from childhood and realize I had no one to share the memory with who would understand. I grieved the family I'd never had, and I grieved the version of myself who'd believed I could earn their love through good behavior. That version of me was gone, And I missed him sometimes, missed his hope, his optimism, his naive belief that love was something you could work for, something you could deserve, something you could finally, eventually earn if you just kept trying. But I didn't want to be him anymore, because being him meant accepting crumbs and calling it a feast. It meant tolerating mistreatment and calling it family. It meant disappearing and calling it peace. And I was done disappearing, even if it meant being alone. Here's what I've learned. Some families don't want children. They want props. They want extras in the movie they're directing about their own lives. They want supporting characters who make them look good, who never threaten the narrative, who exist to validate their story without ever telling one of their own. I was never supposed to be a person. I was supposed to be a role. The black sheep. The difficult one. The one who was always causing problems by having the audacity to exist fully, to have opinions, to remember things differently, to refuse to pretend. And when I stopped playing that role, when I stepped out of the story they'd written for me, I became something worse than difficult. I became irrelevant. But here's the thing they never understood. Irrelevance is freedom. They thought exclusion was punishment. They thought silence was a weapon they could wield to bring me back in line. They thought if they withheld their approval long enough, I'd come crawling back, ready to accept whatever terms they offered. They were wrong. Because you can't withhold something I've stopped wanting. I don't want the version of love that requires me to betray myself. I don't want the version of family that requires my silence. I don't want the version of belonging that has a price tag attached. I want to be known, actually known. And that requires being seen. And being seen requires being honest. And honesty in a family built on performance is an act of destruction. I didn't destroy this family. I just refused to help maintain the illusion. And apparently, that's the same thing. My mother calls occasionally. Brief, polite conversations where she asks surface-level questions and waits for surface-level answers. She never asks why I don't come around anymore. She never acknowledges the distance. She never mentions the silence. It's like she's calling a version of me that doesn't exist anymore. The dutiful son who's just been busy, who will come back eventually, who will forgive the unspoken and forget the unsaid and return to the fold like none of this ever happened. But I remember all of it. The glances, the silences, the systematic erasure, the way they needed me to be small so they could feel big. The way they needed me to be wrong so they could feel right. The way they needed me to be the problem so they never had to look at their own. And I'm not angry anymore. That's what's strange. I'm not bitter. I'm not plotting revenge. I'm not waiting for apologies that will never come, or recognition that will never be given. I'm just clear. Clear about what this was. Clear about what they wanted from me. Clear about the choice I had to make between their approval and my integrity. I chose integrity. And integrity is lonely sometimes. But it's mine. They have their story. The one where I'm the distant son who pulled away for reasons they can't quite understand. The one where they did everything right and I was just difficult. The one where my absence is my fault, my choice, my failing. And I have mine. The one where I learned that being honest costs something. That speaking truth to family is often harder than speaking it to strangers. That some relationships are built on sand, and the moment you stop pretending the foundation is solid, everything falls apart. Both stories are true from where we're standing, but only one of them leaves room for me to exist as I actually am. So I live in my story now. I've built a life in it, a life that doesn't require constant performance or careful editing or strategic silence. A life where I can remember things as they actually happened. Where I can feel what I actually feel. Where I can be who I actually am. And yes, it's lonely sometimes. Yes, I wish it were different. Yes, there's a part of me that still mourns what could have been if they'd been different people. Or if I'd been a different person. But I've stopped trying to fix it. Stopped trying to bridge the gap. Stopped trying to translate myself into a language they're willing to speak. Because here's what I know now. You can't make someone see you if they've decided you're invisible. You can't make someone hear you if they've decided you're silent. You can't make someone love you if what they love is the idea of control more than the reality of connection. Some families don't want real relationships. They want compliant ones. And I am not compliant. I'm honest. I'm present. I'm real. And if that makes me the black sheep, then I'll wear that label differently than they intended. Not as a mark of shame, but as a badge of integrity. I still think about that Thanksgiving dinner sometimes, about the moment I corrected my mother's story, about how that one small act of honesty fractured everything. But I think about it differently now. I used to think I'd made a mistake, that I should have stayed quiet, that I should have let her have her version of the past, even if it wasn't true, that my need to be honest was selfish, destructive, inappropriate. Now I understand. I wasn't the one who destroyed anything. The fragility was already there. I just stopped holding it together. They built a family on a foundation of silence and selective memory and carefully curated narratives. And they needed everyone to participate in maintaining that structure. They needed everyone to agree, everyone to pretend, everyone to perform. And when I stopped performing, the whole thing fell apart. But that's not my fault. That's not my failure. That's just proof that it was never as solid as they wanted to believe. Real families can withstand honesty. Real love doesn't require lies. Real belonging doesn't demand erasure. And if those things break a relationship, then the relationship was already broken. You just made the break visible. I don't know what your story is. I don't know what rule you broke, or what truth you told, or what role you refused to play. I don't know if you're still trying to earn their love, or if you've already let go, or if you're somewhere in between. But I know this: if being yourself makes you the enemy, the problem isn't you. If telling the truth creates distance, the closeness was built on lies. If your honesty is treated like betrayal, the loyalty they wanted was never meant to serve you. You're not too sensitive. You're not too difficult. You're not too much. You're just awake in a family that prefers everyone asleep. And waking up is lonely. I won't lie about that. It's lonely, and it's hard, and some days you'll wonder if it was worth it. Some days you'll want to go back to pretending, back to performing, back to playing the role that made everyone else comfortable. But you can't. Not really. Because once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you know, you can't unknow. Once you've tasted what it feels like to exist without constantly betraying yourself, you can't go back to that smaller life. You can only go forward, into the loneliness. Yes, but also into the truth, into the integrity, into the version of yourself that doesn't require permission to exist. So here's my question for you. Not the question they're asking. Not, why can't you just get along? Or, why do you have to make everything so difficult? Or, why can't you just let it go? Here's my question. What if the silence was never about punishing you? What if it was always about revealing who they really are? What if the distance was never your failure? What if it was their choice? What if the problem had never been you at all?